Welcome to part 9 of my Eternal set review. Today it's time to talk about the Feln cards. So let's get started. The first card is Feln's 1 power double influence card, as we've seen in the other combinations before. This one is a lot better than, for example, the Recano version, simply because a 2-2 flyer is still pretty good past turn 1 compared to a 3-1 Overwhelm, for example. So this is a really good card in Limited and even in Constructed. The Haunting Scream decks often play 4 of these just as a way to apply some pressure early and get some damage in while they control the board with removal and try to set up their infiltrate stuff. And in Limited, this is just a great card. A 1 power 2-2 flyer normally costs you 3 power and is just really good. Like, imagine doing something for 2 on turn 3, like a removal, annihilate, or a 2 power unit. And in addition, you get to play a 2-2 flyer for 1. That's such an incredible tempo swing that will get you a huge advantage usually. So just overall a pretty good card in both formats. Just don't expect it to be an actual 1-drop, because unless you have a Seed of Cunning and a Sigil, that's not gonna happen. But sometimes it happens and then it's even better. Next we have Gorgon Swiftblade, a premium 2-drop. 2-3 is pretty solid stats, because a lot of 2-drops only have 2 attacks, so they either run into him and don't die if they have more than 2 toughness, or they are 2-2s and simply would die to a Swiftblade. So the Swiftblade is a really good early defense and can also attack pretty well in opposing 2-drops, because a lot of them are 2-2 and therefore either have to jump block the Swiftblade or let the infiltrate trigger. So a great Limited card, premium 2-drop if you're in the Feln colors, and even in Constructed, one of the best 2-drops in the color combinations. Maybe the best, probably the second best after the Argent Port 3-3. Next we have Grim Stranger, another Stranger, also a pretty unexciting one. In Limited, this can at least be an okay 2-drop if you still need a 2-drop, even though a 2-2 with a pretty irrelevant ability is not exciting. But if what you need is just a 2-2 for 2, that guy can fill the role, but that's all he's gonna do. And in Constructed, yeah, this is, even in a Stranger deck, this would not be a top choice, and there is not even a good Stranger deck, so you can basically forget about this guy. Next we have Haunting Scream. I think in Limited this card is not so great, simply because it needs to got a bunch of good targets in order to be worth it, like mostly Beastcaller and Gorgon Fanatic. And if you don't have that, the card is just gonna be a 1-shot damage spell basically, and not even a very good one. But in Constructed, this is a really great build around card. There's a deck named after this card that basically tries to maximize Gorgon Fanatic and Beastcaller, plays a bunch of removal cards to help enable a Fanatic and Beastcaller to connect, and Haunting Screams. And the combination of Dark Return and Haunting Scream is also really nice, because the unit permanently gets charge and flying, so if you return them with a Dark Return afterwards, they will still have charge and flying, which is really nice. So basically, after the first Haunting Scream, every Dark Return turns into a 1 power pseudo Haunting Scream that gives the unit +1/+1. Although, to be fair, Haunting Scream costs 1 power in total to do the trick, while Dark Return usually costs you 4 power in total to do the same thing, because you have to pay 1 for the Dark Return and 3 for the unit. But still, in case of Beastcaller, the unit doesn't die. Fanatic dies anyway, so there it doesn't make a difference. But yeah, the card is a really nice Constructed tool. In Limited, pretty situational. A late pickup maybe if you have enough things that work well with it. Next we have Feln Bloodcaster. A pretty good defensive 3-drop. A staple in the Feln control deck, since 2-5 blocks most early game units without dying, and in the late game you get to draw 2 cards. If you have some spare power, you can just sink 7 power into this guy and draw 2 cards. In limited, this guy is still also pretty solid, but only in defensive mid-range and control decks for obvious reasons, because he's not a good attacker, but he's a really good blocker and a good card advantage engine in the late game. Or better source, not an engine, because you can only do it once. To not mistake that by people that don't know how Ultimate works. Next we have Feln Cauldron, a card that I personally think is terrible. I've seen this played in decks, but I think it's just really bad. Basically you invest 3 power for a card that does nothing, absolutely nothing, and then once per turn you throw away one of your cards to gain 1 life, simply to eventually 5 turns later, after you've basically been down 1 card per turn. After 4 turns you're down 4 cards for 4 turns by then. You get to draw 5 random spells. And they're even random, so you can't even control how good they will be in the situation you're in, how helpful they are. And and basically what you did is you spent 5 cards plus the cauldron, so 6 cards, on gaining 5 life and 5 random spells, which sounds like a terrible, terrible deal. I know the people that play this play it in Haunting Scream as a way to like discard their unit and Haunting Scream it on turn 4 and all, and discard kind of dead removal and stuff, but yeah, still not worth it. Just a terrible card in my opinion in both formats. Costs tons of time, power and resources to get less back than you invested after way too long of a time. Just awful. Next we have Gorgon Fanatic. This guy, as already mentioned, is a staple in the Haunting Scream constructed deck, just a great card. You get to draw 3 cards and 3 life, which is a lot of card advantage for 3 power, and the 3 life helps to make up a bit for the tempo lost in making this guy actually connect and trigger his infiltrate. And even in limited, 3 power, 3/2, it's not terrible, and you usually in Feln have plenty of ways to actually make him connect with the opponent and trigger, so even there it's a pretty good card. But make sure that your deck is slow enough and defensive enough to afford to lose its 3-drop unit to draw cards and gain life rather than impact the board, because otherwise you might find yourself on the wrong end of tempo with your extra cards and just lose with a grip full of cards. Next we have Midnight Gale, another interesting card in the sense that it requires more influence than it requires power, so it's basically a 4 influence 3 power card, which in limited usually makes this a turn 4 plus play, not a turn 3 play as it might seem, but in constructed enabling the 4 influence by turn 3 is not that big of a deal with the 8 dual lands. You simply have to draw 1 in time usually to make this happen, so it's a fairly reliable 3-drop in constructed. So a 4/3 flying for 3 is already a really good deal, and the fact that it becomes a 4/3 flying lifesteal from the second turn on that it gets to attack is really nice and makes it really hard to raise, and a really good unit when you're on the offensive. Yeah, just a really good card. It's a bit off in the sense that it's not that easy to find a home in it because the Feln colors in general are not that aggressive, but there's some Feln mid-range approaches that try to utilize this card, and some people play a couple of them in their Haunting Scream deck just as a way to get proactive and also buy some time by gaining life. But yeah, all in all, a really powerful card that just in constructed lacks a bit of a home currently, like a proper home. There's like no top deck that says, alright, this is the guy I want, I play 4 of them. But yeah, in limited it's a really good legendary. I wouldn't necessarily say a bomb, but a really good legendary with kind of restrictive requirements though. Next we have Recurring Nightmare. This card is somewhat interesting and nice in design. First glance, it's a 3 power 1/1 flying charge, which is very underwhelming. But if you look at the infiltrate, it grows into a larger threat every time, and also it's protected from things like permafrost and other non-spell speed spells, since once it deals damage to the opponent, it doubles its attack and then jumps back to your hand. So it doesn't have to be in play during your opponent's turn, and deals damage in increments of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16 and so on. So this is a really nice card against slower decks that have few ways to interact with this, like for example a sideboard card against control in Constructed, or even a main deck card if your deck can handle it against slower decks like controlling decks. And the same goes for limited. In limited it's a little less interesting just because decks are less focused and have less of a clear control strategy, being all vulnerable to this. But it can still be decent. I've played it a couple times in limited and it was quite alright. Plus you have to remember, once it's big, you can always just play it and not attack. So it stays in play and you can use it to trade with a big unit of the opponent, for example. Next we have Trickster's Cloak, another card that's usually not suited for Constructed just because it's a bit underwhelming and nothing that Constructed decks usually look for, especially in those colors. But in limited is a pretty good 3-drop weapon that synergizes well with the infiltrate cards of the combination. For example, you can, sorry about that, had the yawn there. You can put that on a turn 2 Gorgon Swiftblade, suddenly you have a 4/5 that turns into a 4/5 deadly quick draw, and therefore once the unblockable wears off the next turn, he's pseudo unblockable anyway because he has deadly and quick draw, and the opponent needs to put like 5 lethal units in front of him in order to block him, block and kill him. So they need hard removal or need to jump block him, or take 4 each turn. So yeah, that's a pretty nice limited card in the right deck. Nothing super exciting, but a pretty solid enabler for infiltrate and a decent weapon. Next we have Feeding Time, premium removal basically. A bit worse than Death Strike in the sense that it doesn't have spell speed, it's a spell, not a fast spell. But for that we get the upside of transforming the unit into a pig before we kill it, which matters against units with Entomb triggers and decks that would potentially return cards from their void. So transforming, say, an Umbran Reaper into a pig before we kill it means there's no Drain 5 happening and stuff like that. Or same for Soulfire Drake and his Entomb and stuff like that. So this is a pretty nice way to get around some of the more powerful Entomb effects in the game, which is why you often see a split of Death Strike and Discard in Feln decks in Constructed. Next we have Champion of Cunning. The champion of the Feln combination is one of the weaker champions. It's not a terrible champion, but I would say it's somewhere between place 3 and 4 in terms of champions. I mean, nothing beats the Combray champion in how bad it is, but this is potentially worse than the Elysian champion and definitely worse than the Rakano and the Stone Scar champions. So yeah, and also by the fact alone that it requires 5 influence of each color and costs 5 makes it worse because it's slower. This used to be a lot better than it is right now, but the way it is right now, it's still alright. Like, you get a 5/5 flying Aegis if you play it with the Primal Influence enabled, and if you play it with the Shadow Influence enabled, since usually by turn 5 you can be glad if you have one of the two enabled. In most games, especially in limited. In limited it's nearly impossible most of the time to enable either influence by the time you play it on turn 5. But yeah, with the Shadow Influence, at the end of your turn, all your units get a permanent +2 attack, which can get out of hand really quickly, which makes this card a pretty nice card in Limited. I mean, a 5 power 5/5 is already pretty good in Limited, and if there's kind of a standoff, if this triggers like 2 times or 3 times, the game should be over by then, and a 5/5 flying Aegis for 5 is also pretty impressive. So, and yeah, if you ever have both enabled, the game will end pretty quickly, and the opponent will also have a hard time to stop the champion from doing his work. So in Limited, this is a really great card. In Constructed, it's a bit so-so. You sometimes see it in the rare Feln mid-range decks. There's very few people that try this in Haunting Scream. All in all, the card is not that exciting Constructed and doesn't really have a home right now. Next we have Spell Swipe. Basically an alternate version of Backlash. Instead of dealing 2 damage to the opponent, we get to draw the card that we counter. But in order for that to happen, we have to be in Feln, not only in Primal, and have to pay 5 power, which is a lot, which makes this card not very exciting. In Limited, definitely a bad card, very clunky. The opponent does not necessarily even have a good target for this. In Constructed, also not a good card, at least for the main deck, but this can be an interesting sideboard card in Constructed against certain decks that rely on specific powerful spells that are not only worth countering but also worth stealing. Like, for example, spell swiping a Harsh Rule is probably not what you're looking for. Backlash would serve you a lot better there. But if the opponent is playing, say, a Channel the Tempest, for example, spell swiping that can be pretty sweet. But there's not really a Channel the Tempest deck right now. But yeah, there might be decks where you could see this being good and want to put this in your sideboard. Next we have Withering Ridge, basically a nice enabler for the Feln colors. Works really well with the 3 power -1/-1 to all enemy units, Lightning Storm, with Black Sky Harbinger. There's plenty of ways to deal 1 or 2 damage to all opposing units. Combined with this card, that basically means a makeshift Harsh Rule, especially a one-sided one that adds a 1/4 to the board, which is really nice. So yeah, this is a pretty good card in slow mid-range decks and control decks basically, and an interesting sideboard card as well. And in Limited, this is also still pretty good because setting all your opponent's units' health to 1 makes sure that they will all trade with whatever you have normally, unless they have quick draw, which is really nice, and makes combat a lot easier, especially if your opponent has a bunch of beefy guys that you had trouble with before. And a 1/4 also makes for a decent blocker of one of these units that freshly have only 1 health. Next we have Black Sky Harbinger. As already mentioned, great combo piece together with turn 5 Withering Witch, turn 6 Black Sky Harbinger, kill all the opposing units, gain a bunch of life. But even if not, this usually gains you a couple of life the turn you play it. Might finish off an opposing relic weapon, maybe 1 or 2 small units that are lying around, and after that you have a 3/5 flying lifesteal that can either attack to gain you 3 life a turn and pressure the opponent a bit, or hold off a bunch of smaller opposing units that survived its trigger, simply because between the 3/5 stats and the lifesteal, it is really hard to profitably attack into this guy unless you have pretty big units. So yeah, in Limited, this is a staple, and in Constructed basically as well. Next we have Nightmare Sight Unseen, the legendary 7-drop of Feln. In Constructed, this guy is pretty unexciting and uninteresting because it's basically a 7/7 for 7 that, if it gets killed, is as if it never happened, since it has no remaining effect or summon trigger. And also, if you rely on its unblockability in Constructed and attack with your team, and your opponent just kills it and then blocks all your units and kills them in combat because their units were better than yours, which is where you want unblockability, is very dangerous. That thing also can happen in limited, but it's less likely because there's less removal that can blow you out like that. And you can also just like time this and turn a board stall into a win. I would say it's a pretty good finisher in limited, but a pretty bad constructed card. Last but not least, we have another 8-drop legendary, Snow Crush Animist. A 4/5 for 8 at first seems pretty underwhelming. Deadly helps a bit, but not too much because we would rather have bigger stats that would have the same effect as Deadly basically. But the summon trigger is where it's at. It's basically a 4/5 Deadly attached with like a better Crystallize. We get to kill everything that has 3 attack or less, and the big guys will be stunned just like in a Crystallize, where Crystallize basically says kill everything with 1 health and stun all other enemy units. This basically says kill everything that has 3 attack or less and stun the rest, and adds a body to the board. You often see this as a one-off in Feln control because it's a nice way to try and stabilize the board, especially with the 4/5 Deadly being capable of potentially dealing with like the big guy that's left over in combat and trading with it and stuff like that, and also buys you time. So yeah, in limited this is a bomb. 8 power is a lot, but every time you play this should basically mean you win the game. And in constructed it's a situationally interesting card due to being a body and somewhere between a sweeper and a tempo play. So yeah, not the worst card in constructed, a bomb in limited. Okay, that concludes the review of Feln. Next time I'm gonna go over the remaining cards, which are all the Stone Scar cards and the Factionless cards, and then I'm gonna start with stuff like deck techs and draft videos, but not sure if I will do anything before Christmas and New Year's Eve, because I'm gonna be gone for a while. Maybe I'll do like 1 deck tech with a couple of games before I leave, and then you can expect more frequent content at the beginning of the new year for limited and constructed basically. Alright, if you found this interesting, helpful and or entertaining, please like and subscribe to help the channel grow, and tell your friends. And yeah, leave any kind of questions, criticism or discussion in the comments. I read all my comments and reply to everything as good as I can. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye!